So, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to introduce the first panel. Let me start with Professor Dirke Hecker. She's Professor for Legal Comparisons and Director of the Institute for European and Cooperative Law. I use the English term because it's an English institution located at the Oxford University. Then Professor Peter Huber. He is a judge at the Federal Constitutional Court, and he also holds faculty for public law and state philosophy at the University of Munich. The third panelist is Professor Sven Simon, National Law, European Law at the Philipps University of Marburg in Germany, and has become a member of the European Parliament recently. And he's voting for the Christian Democrats. Is that correct? Yes. And the fourth panelist is Professor Dr. Clemens Fuest, the president of the IFO Institute in Munich and for Financial Sciences and National Economy at the University of Munich. And I'm very happy that I can ask a few questions in a minute. All right. So the panel really tallies with the presentation or the content of the presentation which we heard. It's about values, about identities, and I thought I'm going to start with the values. You know, now I can ask a constitutional law judge, I would like to know what is the correlation or the relationship between values, Europe as a community of values or as a community of common laws. Now, is one dependent on the other, or are they separate, or how can I distinguish between the two?
Well, this term of values, if we've dealt with this before Europe, it was the Federal Constitutional Court back in the 1950s, at its very beginning, talked about the basic rights in our basic law, and they also derived this from objective decisions on values. And if you consider this in legal terms, as the speaker before me said, we're a community of law. If you take Article 2, values, these cannot be considered as a general description of the situation, but they should be seen as the basic structures and principles on which the European Union is based and which are in common for all member states. So what we have here is a very specific, and the rule of law has existed for over 20 years, and this is something that is a very legal context. For example, the process against Poland that you can see as an example. But when we talk about tolerance, here legal experts in the last 200 years have been not that interested in this question. And when it comes to solidarity and how far that goes, the basic law talks about the solidarity of a social state. Well, it's the task of the political process. That's what we go to the polls for, and something happens in between.
So from a perspective, values are defined very precisely. I attended a panel discussion, and the former Czech foreign minister said, and I hope I quote him correctly, he said, European values in this per se do not exist. So I think that this is a challenging expression. What did he mean? He meant that the community of values which Europe feels it is belonging to goes beyond Europe. Now, the question whether those in New Zealand have got different values in comparison with the Germans or the Portuguese and the German, you know, they live in the same, say, community of values in comparison with the New Zealanders and the Germans. So now this is really an important question when it comes to building or building an identity. Europe and Canada, these are two different countries. You know, my question is, how do you see this? I would like to ask you, because, you know, these conflicting values is something you have experienced, you know, being a German working in Oxford.
Well, I think you first have to think about what it means For example, if the European Court of Justice says that our values are derived from the constitutional traditions of the member states, does that mean that we only have specifically European values which delimit us from other countries? Or are we trying to come up with a basic consensus where we hope and demand that these can be derived? So these values, for example, between Germany and New Zealand or other countries countries outside of Europe, historically speaking, it's not surprising because the right in most countries are based on European legal traditions. Now the question is this a problem in Europe if we don't delimit ourselves in terms of our values, if we cannot define ourselves in that way? Well, you mentioned the United Kingdom and the tradition there. We do have certain divergencies in legal tradition with the continent, and up until now, we had all agreed that the values that we have at a European level and that we all want to share and don't necessarily want to delimit ourselves with regard to non-European countries, we believe that these are also enshrined in British tradition. And if you consider parliamentarianism, for example, it's very strong there when we talk about the rule of law, as is the case in continental Europe. So for this reason, there is a different tradition, if it does exist, does not necessarily mean that this would call into question the question of the identity of the European Union.
Well, I would like to continue asking. There is the idea that the common European values will create some identity for Europe. But if these are, say, corroborated by another group of states, then how can these European values, which actually go beyond Europe, can, build identities for Europe? How can they do so?
Well, let me begin by saying that historically, they were developed here in Europe. They were developed by the Europeans and fought for by the Europeans. This is also a feature of our identification. So if others adopt our values, that's nice. We also advertise for that. We cannot force it upon them. It has to be fought for in society itself, maybe somewhat differently. And maybe in China, individualism is something that existed in the past, that there's maybe a list of human rights in Africa that was just not called that or have not been researched on as much. But the Europeans have fought for all of this. This is part of our identification, which distinguishes us from the others, if you want to see this distinguishing feature as part of our identification.
Okay, I now built the bridge to identity because I wanted to present good news here. Just now, I Googled what leading research institutes say about European identity. In this case, it was the American Institute PEW study of 2018. And the question was, how do you support the idea, I am proud of my country, or very proud of my country? So in European 15 countries, 86% say so, but 78% say the same about Europe. They say, I am proud of Europe, or I'm very proud of Europe. There are differences between various countries. The Germans, for instance, 78% are proud of Germany or very proud of Germany. The Finns, 94% say that they are proud or very proud of Europe. Are proud of their country. And of course, this is also reflected in the answers about Europe. The Finns are most proud of Europe or being a part of Europe. I believe this is good news, which I would like to bring to you. At least I see it as good news. And I would like to link it to a question to Mr. Fust. So what are the reasons for determining a European identity? So I believe what is important when you want to answer this question is not how this question varies over time. You know, the European currency crisis in Europe was important. Now, what are factors which might, create identity?
I think it's important to recall that Europe is not the same thing as the EU. So in other words, the institutions that we have set up in the EU, that's one thing. Europe is something else. They belong together, of course, but if you take a look at polls and data and questions, what will the people answer when it comes to, do you identify with Europe or do you identify more? And you come up with very different answers. In both cases, we can see if you're more educated or if you travel abroad more often, these people, or somebody who's younger, will identify more frequently with Europe. And it's quite interesting to note that a lot of people think that the older generation would feel more European due to their experience in war, but that is not the case. The younger generation identifies more with Europe. And of course, you can also say that maybe that's a good sign, assuming, however, that we're not talking about the young people don't become like the people who are old today. That can happen too when they grow older. Sorry for putting it that way, but that was just a question of logic. So, of course, this is perhaps also a problem if we consider some of the presentations we've heard. Those people who identify with Europe, it's not surprising. It's the elite. And this is also, they will profit from this as well. And the other question may be, is there someone who is not part of the elite, of the lower middle class, who would identify with Europe? Are there people who even know what the values are in the European Constitution? I have my doubts there. Empirically speaking, identification is given, yes.
Möchte der Verfassungsrechtler was?
So do you want to comment on this? That is, to what extent the Constitution has an effect on building identity, or what is the relationship between identification or identity, which you feel for Europe, is based on a common tradition of constitutions, or maybe there is a field of tension?
Well, we do have a phenomenon. There is the secularization in the Constitution, and this is obvious in the U.S. Constitution and in our basic law, which is now 70 years old. It is also quite clear. On the 3rd of October last year, I was at the Brandenburg Gate, and there was a performance of the Gorki Theater, and the Gorki Theater took some articles from the Basic Law, and they sang out the text of the Basic Law. And this was late summer. There were 40,000 people there, children, etc., and they were all together for 45 minutes. And then I thought, well, we are now sacralizing this, so that means I think we've not gotten that far with our European treaties. I think in the last version, that was from 2009, this was the Treaty of Lisbon, and I think that this is a question of time. And identities, of course, are formed by your own life and in your delimitation to others as well. And social psychologists have taught me that we can talk about this for several centuries, historic experience, for example, and this is binding for us. That's why the 30 Years' War is still a trauma here in Germany. And with this whole movement, we can say that the European treaties, the treaties of Rome, once they existed for long enough and have been accepted by people, and we can also see the European courts, if they do their job and the Commission does not exaggerate things, and if they say people are motivated in things like this, then I think we can have them in a global context, get everything in order. Then I think over the course of time, this will be something which will help form the identity of Europeans. I think it would be good if we took all of the technical regulations and eliminate them and then just limited ourselves to some basic guarantees. But I do not consider this to be precluded, and I think we can wait and see.
Vielen Dank.
Yes, thank you. I would like to come back to the presentations which we've just heard. They were all about crises and threats from outside. I would like to ask Mr. Seemann, how important are these threats from outside, or what is the potential they might have for politicians? And you will be active there when it comes to building identity in Europe.
Well, of course, you have to mention that they have a certain positive effect. Brexit or Donald Trump's election, this is something which really brought the rest of the European Union closer together. So this plays a very important role. So the question is, security and threats from the outside. These are seen very differently. If you ask in Germany, we really don't have the impression that we're really being threatened. But if you ask people in the Baltic countries, they see things totally differently. And that's why here we see solidarity or a call for solidarity that is being generated. So it does have a major impact. So this threat from the outside in any event.
So this tallies with what social experts say. Identity, this is that of the others, and you are separate from them and develop your own identity. But favoritism in this context, how can you embed it in the political process? How can you implement it in Brussels? Can you use it? Can you harness it? Can you create it productively?
I think that, as you said, if you look at us from the outside, then first of all, you have to ask every young person in Europe. They should have the possibility to spend 6 months in a different European country with a different European family. And I don't want to become a travel agent, but they should give them a ticket to go to Asia for 4 weeks. I think they would all notice that Europeans are different, and maybe they would develop more identification with Europe. We see that we're Europeans, especially when we go to Asia. If we travel within Europe, we don't really notice that. But if we look from the outside and we see that that's different, then we say that, well, maybe we are more similar than we thought, and this might help to increase European identification.
So this means, it might help building identity or developing identity, but what can you do with it? It's like capital, isn't it? It's like a resource which you could use in political terms, or which you should use politically. So maybe it's the opposite in the UK. So maybe this, universal question to Mr. Hecker. One, if you were to enter politics, what would you like to create for Europe using this capital? And what is the situation in UK? Is it more like a problem, i.e., there is a delineation or demarcation from Europe? Or how do you see or perceive identity in the UK?
Well, to pick up on what Mr. Seaman said, Brexit is not a threat from the outside. It is a perception of the fragile nature of the EU, which we couldn't have imagined, let's say, 5 years ago. And on the continent and in pro-European circles in the UK, it is clear that this Brexit is a risk for the EU project, and this has caused us to reflect on European identity. And that's positive, not only as a technocratic monster, which would tell us the angles that cucumbers can take, and this is to reinforce the awareness of the population. But another level is the level in the UK itself. And here there are two different parties there. There's a huge divide. We have these huge fault lines that you can see in the UK. And those who wanted to leave the EU, the symptom is that there never really was an acceptance of a European identity. Historically, that's related to splendid isolation of the British Empire and the experience that that they were a world power. And then in the mid 20th century, this was no longer the case. And then they slowly but surely became tied to Europe. And then they came from the rule maker to the rule taker in Europe. And this was how it was seen, and the sovereignty of their parliament was seen to be at risk, and it was also press that was also hostile towards Europe in such a way that British identity seemed to be negated, and it was negating the European identity. On the other hand, however, we see that there are people who saw the diversity in the UK. If you think of Scotland, for example, where they have a strong Scottish identity, there too a British identity as well, but also a very strong European identity. And there Brexit had the following impact. Scottish identity, regional or whatever, and the European identity came together, and this led to a trend towards segregation within the UK. So if you ask what I would do, I'm not a politician, and I really don't want to be a politician, but I do think that it is very obvious that there are major forces that can be mobilized via identity.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was told that time is a limited resource, and now I would like to continue the panel discussion with questions from the floor, please.
Washington. Convoco.
I was a former ambassador in Washington. Mr. Fust, you were right. The EU is not Europe. It goes well beyond that. In the past, we always wanted to have a Western identity, and this was related to the Americans. And one thing that was never talked about is we wanted to remain open, also including the U.S. And things have changed completely now. And when I was in Washington, I said that we might have identical interests, but maybe not the same values. And the hierarchy of values has been reversed now. Now you can see that people want Europe. They want the European Union now. And our Eastern neighbors have different values and different hierarchies. Now, I don't know how we can deal with this politically, because the willingness of changing these values the way we see them in Western Europe is something that doesn't seem to exist. So it's going to be a long road ahead, I'm afraid. And this is something that is not going to be achieved by changing the treaties. But I'm afraid that right now we see that there are tendencies going in the other direction.
You put the question to whom?
I'm sorry, there's no microphone.
All right, we heard about the Article 7 process, unanimous decisions. Well, this is something you need, but when looking at Poland, and here we see a few processes related to violations of contracts. You know, the European Court of Justice, the independence of the Polish legal system, and a plethora of other, say, little needle pricks, things that are necessary. When looking at the cooperation between the administrations or the courts of law of the member states, then let's say extradition, or if we have prisoners or accused, send them to others. The Polish High Court presented this case to the European Court of Justice. So in this case, based on this cooperation, Poland would be kicked out of the Union. Now, whether or not we would hurt ourselves in this case, okay, I leave that aside. It will certainly have negative effects and implications for us. In addition, we also have the suggestion that we should use other means, subsidies, and link them to adhering to the values. So if you want to, surely you will find a few items. It doesn't mean that Poland is a monolithic bloc. Hungary also not a monolithic bloc. Say you've got 50 split in the country, one belonging to or going for or favoring PiS and the others favoring the other side. Now, from a European view, there are those looking for autocratic rules, and then there are the others who do not support this. And I'm sure, there are many things that member states have in common.
Yes, I'd also like to answer that. It's a very important question. The values in the EU Constitution should not be confused with the values that people have in different parts of Europe, and they are not the same. Not everyone shares these values, and that's right. It's correct, and I think it's healthy. It's sound. I think we have to be careful here and make sure that we don't say that we have to have everything. If you have to say that you agree with all of these values as expected in Brussels and Berlin, and that they would be sanctioned. I think Ursula von der Leyen, when she spoke to Parliament, she put it very well. She said, let's begin a dialogue. Let's try to understand one another better. So why in Poland do we have certain behavior? We don't have to understand everything, and we don't have to see that we don't have to understand every anti-democratic tendency, but I think the dialogue is important to me. And when a Hungarian said to me, are you familiar with our history? Our history is such that we were occupied and threatened for centuries by the Ottoman Empire and people who came from that area. And that's why we react differently to immigration as opposed to the Germans, and they had so much guilt, and they have to make up for that. So I can understand that 100%. I think what we need is a dialogue, and I would understand these values as an invitation to have a dialogue. I think it's a problem to say that these are rules, and if you don't abide by all of them in full, will not be accepted. That's how I understand it.
I assume we've got time for one or two more questions, please. Thank you, Harald Einsmann, Procter & Gamble. So now involved in, or dealing with American startups, Europe and other aspects here. Let us assume that Europe is a necessity. If you want to compete with America, China, India, then it is relatively easy. John Major last week said the 50 million BRICS think they will get the same or a better deal if 500 million Europeans have their head examined. I hope that's true. So now we face a problem with Poland and Hungary, and you say we have to have a dialogue. That's fine, but we have rules saying, discontinuing subsidies to these countries or no longer allowed to take a vote. The Poles said, okay, we kick you out, and the Hungarians said, we'll kick you out. Now, we have a central system in Brussels. And now, Mrs. von der Leyen, do you think that she will be able to make these ideas impossible?
Mr. Simon, yes, I'll be brief. I've told I have to be brief. For Article 7, you're right. There we need unanimity apart from the country in question, and that doesn't work. But with the budget for the EU, we do have the possibility to distribute the funds differently. We just have to focus more on education and research, which means that more money would go to Germany and less to Hungary. These are things that can be done, and these are things we have to think about. Maybe that's a possibility. I don't think it will be successful, however. We need a public discussion. We need to get the people in favor of this. They have to also take these values on board. So again, it's a question of the free secular state is based on things that they cannot guarantee, not with the best court or whatever. It's only the people that can achieve that.
Vielen Dank. Damit
Thank you.